a brown briefcase, a summer hut instead of a bunker, one table leg in the wrong place. The Wolf's Lair at Rastenburg, July 20th, 1944, heat, open windows, a crowded map table, and a charge molded in plastic explosive waiting to rewrite history. Within these opening beats lies the film's heart, a clandestine brotherhood of officers who judged that with Hitler, Germany was doomed. Without him, an armistice and a moral salvage might still be possible. That is the thesis they carried like contraband through corridors of power. Their wager was simple and terrifying. Remove the dictator, then move the state before terror could regrow its head. But this wooden room did not spring from nowhere. Its splinters are the end of a trail that begins in 1938, when Chief of the General Staff Ludwig Beck resigned, rather than endorse reckless war after the Sudeten crisis. From that act of refusal, the line bends through the Abwehr under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, through Hans Oster's whispered warnings to foreign contacts, and into the conscience of Henning von Tresckow and the iron will of Claus von Stauffenberg. The question that drove them is the question that opens our story. Can a professional army sever itself from a ruler it once swore to obey? The oath sworn in 1934, personal fealty to Adolf Hitler, stood like a legal wall and a moral narcotic. Breaking it would demand both a detonator and a doctrine. The Wolfsschanze, Wolf's Lair, was conceived as a fortress of certainty. It spread across East Prussian forest, mines, barbed wire, watchtowers, zones of access. Yet routine could not armor every moment. On hot days, briefings shifted to a timber hut where air moved more easily. Timber breathes, timber vents blast. The men inside smelled resin, damp wood, ink, and sweat. The map table groaned with pins marking battlefronts that stretched from the bocage of Normandy to the marshlands east of Minsk. By mid-1944, each pin meant bleeding divisions, thinning fuel stocks, and columns of refugees clattering across cobbles. Attrition had a sound, the far hum of bombers, the ring of damaged rail, the static of failing radios. The conspirators were not a political party, nor saints canonized by clarity. Some had cheered early victories. Some recoiled only when lawlessness fused with defeat. But in different rooms they converged on a premise. The regime was annihilating Germany's future and poisoning the army's honor. The Commissar order, the mass shootings by Einsatzgruppen behind army group sectors, deportations that turned sidings into gulfs. These were not rumors. They were facts carried by couriers, hinted in after-action reports seen at the periphery of marches. Canaris's Abwehr offered a porous roof under which skeptics could think. Oster leaked what he could when he believed leaks might still deflect catastrophe. Tresckow, a mathematically minded staff officer on the Eastern Front, began to translate revulsion into operations, time, access, blast, and consequence. Then came Stauffenberg. A cavalryman who read poetry and studied logistics, he returned from North Africa mutilated by war. Right hand gone, 2 fingers missing on the left, 1 eye blinded by shrapnel. Pain scraped him down to purpose. Germany, he believed, must be torn out of the grip of a leadership that mistook fanaticism for strategy. His wounds became camouflage. An injured colonel with a briefcase could navigate guards with the familiarity of rank and the pathos of sacrifice. Here lay the paradox that threads the narrative. A bomb without orders is an explosion. Orders without a bomb are paper. The wooden room would be the trigger. Berlin's Bendlerblock would be the engine. Operation Valkyrie, intended as a reserve mobilization plan to quell internal unrest, could be rewritten to seize ministries, isolate Joseph Goebbels' propaganda apparatus, disarm Waffen-SS detachments with regular Ersatzheer troops, and declare the army guardian of order after a sudden leadership emergency. Legal form might hold the state steady while conscience did its work. By July 1944, the war's acoustics had changed. Allied heavy bombers droned over the Ruhr. In the east, the Red Army's Operation Bagration hammered Army Group Center. Cities smelled of char and wet plaster after firestorms. Trains arrived late and lighter. Sentries at headquarters smoked and watched the tree line with a new inward silence. Meanwhile, within the conspiracy's tight circles, questions narrowed to inches and seconds. Where to place the charge? How to start the fuse with damaged hands? When to escape the cordon and board a waiting aircraft? Everything would balance on the placement of a briefcase and the thickness of a table leg. The thesis hardened. The army serves the nation, not the man. A wooden room would test whether that line could still hold. In 1938, during the Sudeten crisis, Ludwig Beck concluded that strategy had yielded to delusion. He resigned as chief of the general staff because he believed preventive war against the Western powers would be national suicide. Around him, Colonel Hans Oster and Admiral Wilhelm Canaris felt for British contacts, probing whether a coup in Berlin could avert catastrophe if war orders came. Munich's agreement in September 1938 handed Hitler prestige and smothered momentum. The generals who might have moved hesitated in the glow of apparent triumph. After the occupation of Prague in March 1939, the mask slipped, but speed favored the regime. When the Wehrmacht drove into Poland in September 1939 and the Western Front collapsed in May-June 1940, dissent retreated underground. The oath mattered. In August 1934, after President Hindenburg's death, the army swore personal allegiance to Adolf Hitler. What had been constitutional duty to a state became fealty to a ruler. That oath functioned as legal fetter and moral anesthetic. Victory reinforced it. Norway fell to combined arms audacity. France collapsed under armored thrusts by panzer divisions coordinated by radio and air power. The army, intoxicated with efficacy, blinked at the gallop's cost. Dissenters found themselves both isolated and ashamed of seeming to argue with success. Yet the resistance did not die. It went to ground and watched for an opening. Barbarossa, launched June 22, 1941, reopened the case with a roar of engines and an avalanche of paperwork. The invasion promised a short war of annihilation against the Soviet Union. It delivered distances measured in fuel and graves. The criminal orders, notably the Commissar order directing the execution of captured political officers, clashed with professional codes and corroded discipline. Behind the spearheads, Einsatzgruppen conducted mass shootings of Jews and other targeted populations, often with logistical cooperation from army units. Officers who had treated law as a weapon now faced lawlessness as policy. Some looked away. Others began to refuse small things or to document or to protect individuals. A few concluded that the regime itself was the problem engine. Canaris's Abwehr became a membrane, permeable enough to let conscience breathe. Oster shared secrets with friends abroad, including early warnings of the 1940 attack in the West and later hints of the 1941 invasion East, hoping to provoke deterrence. These were acts of thread and needle. They did not alter campaigns, but they kept alive a culture of dissent that the Gestapo could not fully map. The conspirators lacked not motive but machinery. Killing Hitler without a plan to legitimize a transition risked civil war, SS counter-coup, or foreign misinterpretation. Germany might fracture into rival commands while the enemy closed in from both horizons. The Bendlerblock in Berlin, headquarters of the replacement army, held the missing lever. Operation Valkyrie, drafted to quell worker unrest or guerrilla sabotage, sat in files as an unglamorous mobilization scheme. It could be revised into a legal switch to seize the state at the instant of leadership decapitation. The concept was stark. Declare an internal emergency, mobilize reserve units under army authority, arrest party and SS leaders as supposed putschists, and restore order. Law as mask. Law as shield. Law as axle for a turn. While that paper architecture took shape, another strand formed at the front. Henning von Tresckow, sharp, disciplined, and cold-eyed, served with Army Group Center near Smolensk. He judged that defeat was now a function of arithmetic: manpower, fuel, industry, and coalition politics. Each week of delay made the end harsher. He began to search for means: explosives compact enough to travel, fuses reliable enough to time. British plastic explosive carried by clandestine channels offered density and stability. Pencil fuses activated by crushing a glass ampule to release acid against a wire offered predictable burn times, if temperature cooperated. By 1941's winter, the general mood shifted. Snow closed on a front still hundreds of kilometers from Moscow, and the Wehrmacht's logistics froze with it. Frostbitten soldiers listened to newsreels that promised final victory and looked out at a horizon that did not move. Within staff circles, dissent turned from questions of policy to questions of action. The first draft of rebellion was written in quiet marginalia: change the annexes of Valkyrie, map radio stations to be seized, list commanders likely to comply once certainty arrived. Meanwhile, the oath still lay like iron on the table. The conspirators needed not only a bomb and a plan, but an answer to their own fear. If they moved and failed, they would stain the very cause they hoped to save. The opening had been sensed. The hinge had not yet turned. Stalingrad's capitulation on February 2, 1943, cracked the myth of inevitability. The Sixth Army's surrender unfurled like a black flag over the entire war effort. In Army Group Center, Henning von Tresckow and his circle, Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorff, Fabian von Schlabrendorff, and other officers of talent and nerve converted outrage into calculus. Killing Hitler was no longer radical. It was rational, a strategic attempt to salvage Germany from total defeat and moral ruin. Meanwhile, in North Africa, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg was shattered by blast and steel. Right hand torn away, 2 fingers gone on the left, 1 eye blinded. Convalescence clarified him. Duty was not obedience to one man. It was stewardship of a nation's life. Assassination, however, is logistics. Who could approach Hitler? Where, with what pretext, and with what device? The Wolf's Lair hardened each month with more concrete, more routine, more handlers. The Berghof and the Reich Chancellery offered fewer chances as the circle constricted. Visitors were searched. Adjutants hovered. The conspirators studied chemistry and schedule with equal care. British plastic explosive answered the need for concentrated power. The pencil fuse, the Zeitzünder, was a fragile marvel. A copper tube with an internal glass ampule. Crush the ampule to release acid that gnaws a restraining wire. When the wire parts, the spring strikes a percussion cap, and the detonator, nested in explosive, drives the main charge. It was reliable, until climate interfered. Tresckow's team rehearsed scenarios. Could a bomber be sabotaged? Could a uniform be altered to carry a device close? Could a suicide attack pierce the cordon? They also rehearsed what came after. Assassination without mobilization would be a spark without tinder. Here, General Friedrich Ulbricht in Berlin became central. He saw power hidden in paperwork. Operation Valkyrie could be re-engineered to trigger the replacement army the instant Hitler was declared dead. Teleprinters would carry pre-formatted orders. Wehrkreis commanders would seize radio stations. Waffen-SS units would be disarmed by regulars. Provincial Gauleiters would be isolated under the pretext of quelling a party putsch. Law would cover speed. The moral terrain was as jagged as the operational one. Some conspirators were early opponents of criminal orders. Others were patriots who had believed in victory and recoiled only when defeat exposed the abyss. They argued not in shouted slogans, but in the friction of risk. Was it legitimate to use the army against the party? Could foreign powers be trusted to deal with a post-Hitler Germany that had begun the worst war in Europe's history? Silence often answered. They acted in motion, not certainty, aware that failure would likely bring slaughter to their families under the doctrine of Sippenhaft kin liability that turned love into exposure. Stauffenberg's rise into the replacement. Army's staff provided access. He could attend briefings, carry maps, and place a briefcase without attracting suspicion. His injuries imposed their own timetable. Every movement cost effort. Arming a fuse one-handed under pressure shortened options. Yet he embraced the role because fate had given him proximity and a signature line. To ignite Valkyrie, someone of rank had to sign the orders and command respect across the Wehrkreise. He paired the explosive with authority, the blow with the switch. By mid-1943, the plotters tested themselves in smaller fires. Messages were drafted, then burned. Names were listed, then paired to preserve secrecy. They observed Hitler's habits, clocked how long he lingered at models and maps, and timed the interval between a placed case and a cleared room. The summer air at Rastenburg promised a weakness, a briefing hut instead of concrete, open windows to cool the crowd. But the same air would scatter force. The problem and the opportunity were twins. The months after Stalingrad thus forged not only resolve but doctrine. Kill the dictator at arm's length. Declare an internal emergency. Move the replacement army under legal cover before the SS and the propaganda ministry could capture the narrative. Then, with microphones and railheads in loyal hands, sue for an armistice, concede occupied territories, and attempt to save what could still be saved, lives, cities, and the possibility that Germany might one day return to law. It was a plan born of defeat, designed for speed, executed by men who expected neither thanks nor survival. The hinge tightened. The detonator was almost ready. Before Stauffenberg armed the fuse at Rastenburg, others tried, and nearly succeeded. March 13, 1943, Smolensk. Tresckow arranged for an explosive package disguised as Cointreau to be placed aboard Hitler's FW-200 Condor for the flight to East Prussia. The pencil fuse, set for minutes, should have crushed its percussion cap and driven the detonator into the plastic explosive. It didn't. In the unheated baggage compartment, sub-zero cold slowed the acid reaction. The wire did not part in time. Hours later, Fabian von Schlabrendorff risked immediate execution to retrieve the dud from a security maze and replace it with innocuous bottles before suspicion could harden. That recovery alone was a feat of nerve. 8 days on, March 21, 1943, Colonel Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorff entered Berlin's Zeughaus for a museum tour with Hitler and high leaders. He carried explosives on a short fuse, prepared to die beside the target in a blast that would decapitate the regime. The Führer rushed the exhibit in minutes, hustled by aides through rooms meant to detain him. The window snapped shut. Gersdorff ducked into a lavatory and diffused with seconds to spare, hands shaking over porcelain while guards paced outside the door. Courage had met schedule and found it merciless. These failures were brutal instructors. Temperature kills chemistry. Minutes matter more than resolve. The architecture of a room can spare a life. Timber walls vent shock. Concrete bottles it. Access points had to be mapped with the precision of a sapper. Entrances, searches, side tables, adjutants' habits. The conspirators revised their doctrine after each miss. They learned to place charges as close as possible to the target and to consider how furniture would direct blast. They learned to carry a second fuse if time allowed, doubling the probability that at least one would burn to the cap. Above all, they learned that assassination is not a gesture. It is a machine of time and materials. Back in Berlin, General Friedrich Olbricht pursued the companion problem: how to turn the instant after the blast into lawful motion. Operation Valkyrie, on its face a plan to suppress internal revolt by mobilizing the Ersatzheer, was rewritten in annex after annex. Teleprinter templates would flow from the Bendlerblock to Wehrkreise in Paris, Vienna, Prague, and beyond. SS offices would be disarmed by regular army detachments. The propaganda ministry would be isolated, radio transmitters seized, and Gauleiters arrested under the pretense of quelling their putsch. Joseph Goebbels' access to the microphones would be the decisive battle space. If he spoke first with Hitler's voice at his back, the coup would drown in sound. The plotters also weighed personalities. General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the replacement army, was essential, a gatekeeper with authority over reserves. He smelled risk like smoke. His cooperation would be conditional and late. They recruited General Olbricht's deputy, Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, and reached out to Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben for post-coup legitimacy. The human map grew. General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel in Paris, ready to act. Erich Höppner in Berlin, stern and decisive. A web of officers in Wehrkreis staffs who would obey if legality was asserted with confidence. Meanwhile, failure did not halt the effort at the front. Tresckow kept testing, kept passing charges and fuses along dangerous chains, kept looking for a gap in routine. Every attempt risked discovery that would roll up the network. Every retrieval of a dud invited searchlights into private lives. The Gestapo was relentless but not omniscient. It did not expect officers to risk all immediately after battlefield reversals. That miscalculation bought time. By the year's end, the lesson book was full. The next attempt had to fuse access and authority, explosives and teleprinters, room geometry and radio control. And it had to be timed against the war's accelerating collapse, Normandy on the western horizon, Soviet offensives thundering in the east. If the blow came too late, it would look like despair and be treated as treason without purpose. If it came at the right moment and the legal switch flipped cleanly, the army could claim stewardship and sue for terms. The line between these outcomes was as thin as a copper wire inside a pencil fuse. The men who handled those wires knew it. They moved anyway. In the Bendlerblock, bureaucratic ink became the plot's steel. General Friedrich Olbricht and his team quietly rewrote the annexes of Valkyrie, page by page, clause by clause, until a routine reserve mobilization order could, at a signal, behave like a blueprint for regime change. The replacement army Ersatzheer would mobilize on cue. Communications hubs would be seized. Radio transmitters occupied. Provincial Gauleiters and SS officers arrested as putschists. The Ministry of Propaganda isolated behind army guards, and weapons issued to units already positioned by the plan's own logic. On paper, it still looked like the restoration of order in the event of civil unrest. In practice, it was a coup in legal dress, yet paper cannot move itself. The missing key was a man who could attend Hitler's briefings, place the device, and then fly back to Berlin with the credibility to sign and the nerve to press send. Stauffenberg's appointment in 1944 as Chief of Staff to General Frum gave him that access. He selected a compact charge, British plastic wound around a detonator and set off by a fast pencil fuse, stowed in a brown briefcase he could set beside a map table. The choreography was brittle, ideally 2 fuses to increase reliability. Arm them quickly with damaged hands. Place the case close, exit on a pretext. Board a waiting aircraft to Tempelhof. Land and trigger Valkyrie across the Wehrkreise. The command network was mapped like a nervous system. In Paris, General Stülpnagel would act on receipt of orders, disarming SS and SD units to prevent retaliation.
In Vienna and Prague, reserve commanders would occupy ministries and radio stations.
In Berlin, Erich Hübner and other senior officers would secure key intersections and isolate Goebbels. Field Marshal Witzleben would step forward to give the coup a face recognizable to the army. The roles were assigned with eye to reputation. Legitimacy would travel at the speed of teleprinters and the cadence of familiar names, but the plan contained its own dilemmas. General Frum remained the crucial hinge and chose to hedge. He wanted proof of Hitler's death before he would commit and feared being left holding the rope if the dictator survived. The conspirators gambled that speed would overwhelm hesitation. If the first wave of orders moved units and seized the microphones, doubters would either comply or be neutralized by momentum. If the microphones stayed in Goebbels' hands, the narrative would invert in minutes and the coup would be branded treason before dusk. Stauffenberg rehearsed the mechanics until they were muscle memory performed by a scarred body. Crush the ampule inside the fuse with pliers. Feel the faint crackle of glass, the slight give as acid begins its slow bite. Tuck the primed charge into the briefcase beside a second unprimed block, in case time allows arming both. Enter with maps and notes. Choose a placement that traps blast under an oak table. Ask to step outside to take a call. Walk away without running. Each verb carried its own risk. Each minute had to be judged against patrol schedules and aircraft availability. By July 1944, strategic necessity and personal resolve converged. Operation Bagration had shattered Army Group Center in the east. In the west, Allied armies pressed out of the Normandy lodgment. German cities flamed at night. Fuel stocks thinned, railways fractured, and the army bled junior leaders it could not replace. Delay no longer promised a better chance. Delay promised only a harsher reckoning. The planners accepted that the operation might fail and still be necessary. Even a failed attempt would draw a line history could see. The last edits to Valkyrie framed treason as duty. Orders stressed the defense of the Reich against internal enemies. Lists of units to be moved were precise. Routes and timings were scripted. Arrest rosters were prepared. The legal language was a mask the army could wear without shame. Behind it stood the true aim: to end a catastrophic war, to halt crimes conducted in the state's name, and to salvage a future for a nation already burning. All that remained was to make a room lethal and a nation briefly still. It began as riot control paperwork and hardened into a blueprint for regime change. Now it hinged on seconds. July 20th, 1944, late morning, in a timber briefing hut at the Wolf's Lair, the heat forced windows open. A heavy oak table dominated. The center, aides and officers pressed around maps of the Eastern Front. Stauffenberg arrived with his adjutant, Werner von Haften. Pressed for time and hampered by his injuries, he armed only one pencil fuse. The second charge remained unprimed in the briefcase. The acid began its slow cut. He set the case near Hitler close to the table's thick leg and excused himself for a telephone call. Guards who had seen him a dozen times waved him past. At 12:42 p.m., the charge detonated. The blast tore the room, blew windows outward, and mangled timbers. 4 men would die of wounds, including General Rudolf Schmundt and 3 others in the tight cluster around the map table. Hitler survived with burns, lacerations, and ruptured eardrums. The table leg and the hut's breathability had saved him. Outside, seeing smoke and soldiers staggering, Stauffenberg judged the mission complete and raced with Haeften toward the car that would take them to the airfield. In the cacophony of alarms, his escape went unnoticed long enough for wheels to lift. Here the paradox revealed itself. Valkyrie depended on certainty. Certainty was unavailable. In flight to Berlin, precious minutes bled away as the Bendlerblock argued over the most important fact in Europe. Was Hitler dead? If yes, the legal switch had to flip instantly to occupy radio stations and disarm the SS before Goebbels could speak. If no, obedience would rebound to the dictator, and the orders would read as treason. Telephones and teleprinters crackled with partial truths, rumors, and counterclaims. General Olbricht pushed to send the orders. General Fromm stalled, demanded confirmation, and sniffed danger. Meanwhile, at Wolfsschanze, the regime moved with reptile speed. Security officers cordoned the site, and a narrative took shape around a miracle of survival and the treachery of criminal officers. Photos of Hitler, bandaged but alive, were prepared for release. An airplane carried the message faster than any infantry column. The dictator still breathed and would speak. As Stauffenberg's aircraft descended toward Tempelhof, that message raced toward microphones in Berlin. Timing, once again, cut like wire. On landing, Stauffenberg strode into the Bendlerblock convinced he had succeeded. He and Olbricht began to push Valkyrie down the lines. Teleprinter orders clattered. Some Wehrkreis commanders moved at once, others waited. In Paris, Stulpnagel received instructions and began arresting SS and SD officers. In Vienna and Prague, reserve units stirred, occupied buildings, then hesitated as contradictory reports arrived. In Berlin, Erich Hupner tried to stiffen spines and impose a chain of command. The corridors of the Bendlerblock filled with messengers and the smell of hot ink. Then the counter voice arrived. Loyal officers patched a live call from the Wolf's Lair to Joseph Goebbels in Berlin. Stauffenberg, pistol at his belt, went to arrest the propaganda minister and found himself confronted with the voice of the man he believed dead. Hitler spoke to a skeptical commander, and the air in the room changed. Certainty flipped polarity. Doubt rushed back in like cold. Orders already sent became evidence. Units that had moved began to halt and reverse. The hinge had turned the wrong way. Yet even then, momentum carried the plotters a few more rooms down the hall. They tried to arrest Fromm. He slipped. They tried to replace hesitation with firmness. It dissolved under the weight of survival instincts. By evening, the coup that had almost moved a state by paperwork and a blast was fought over telephones and stairwells. Outside, Berlin listened for the voice that would tell it what had happened. Inside, men measured the line between courage and futility in the length of a corridor. Afternoon into evening, July 20th. In the Bendlerblock, Olbricht and Stauffenberg drove Valkyrie forward while General Fromm hedged and gathered power to save himself. Orders went out to Wehrkreis commanders. In Paris, General Karl Heinrich von Stulpnagel acted with clarity, arresting SS and SD officers and attempting to seize control before Berlin's truth changed. In Vienna and Prague, reserve units occupied ministries and radio buildings, then faltered as reports contradicted one another. The coup's greatest ally, paper, met its greatest enemy. Communications it did not fully control. Teleprinters moved orders. Microphones moved reality. Joseph Goebbels remained at large in central Berlin, sitting on the junction box of the regime's story. When loyalists connected Wolfsschanze to his office, Hitler's own voice became the decisive weapon. He was alive. He demanded action. The propaganda apparatus pivoted instantly, announcing treason in the army's rear while extolling the Führer's survival as providence. The battle for the wires was lost in a handful of sentences broadcast into a stunned city. In the Bendlerblock, pressure became heat. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben arrived to assume command but found confusion and hesitation. General Erich Hopner tried to steady the staff and impose orders on units already wobbling. Stauffenberg argued that the point remained: act decisively, seize the capital, arrest Goebbels, compel Fromm. Yet the walls were closing. Loyal Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht officers converged on the building. Corridors turned into arguments with pistols, then into standoffs at doors guarded by men who an hour earlier had shared cigarettes. General Fromm chose survival. He turned on the plotters, convened a drumhead court in his own headquarters, and sentenced them to death to prove his loyalty upward. Outside, Berlin's air tasted of ozone and dust as vehicles ground over courtyards. Inside, under arc lamps that threw stark shadows, the first sentences were carried out in haste and fury. General Friedrich Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, and Werner von Heften were shot. Stauffenberg, wounded, faced the firing detail with the steadiness that had brought him to this point. Shots cracked and echoed against stone. The courtyard swallowed their sound. Elsewhere, the coup unraveled in stages. In Paris, Stulpnagel tried to salvage dignity and attempted suicide. He survived and was taken. In the provinces, officers who had obeyed Valkyrie orders suddenly found themselves framed as rebels. Some fled, some confessed, some were betrayed by teleprinter logs that needed no interrogator to explain them. The network that had relied on speed now hung on the slow machinery of arrests and interrogations. And yet, even in defeat, the attempt scarred the regime. The image of invulnerability had been punctured. Hitler knew that officers closest to him had judged him a national danger, and acted accordingly. The SS, the People's Court, and the Gestapo moved to cauterize the wound with terror. Lists were drawn, cells filled. The microphones that had saved the regime would now narrate vengeance. The coup had failed in minutes. Its consequences would unfold for months. The next act would not be a battle. It would be a purge performed as theater, filmed and amplified to teach obedience through humiliation. What did vengeance look like in a dying dictatorship? The answer was a courtroom where law shouted and justice was bound and gagged. Revenge arrived as theater. In the People's Court, Judge-President Roland Freisler turned proceedings into a spectacle of denunciation. Defendants were dragged in without belts or ties to intensify humiliation. He ranted, mocked, interrupted, and denied defense. Cameras whirred to create fear as policy. Over the following months, more than 7,000 arrests were made. Roughly 200 executions followed, often by hanging, some by strangulation with piano wire in Berlin Plötzensee, staged to send a message that loyalty would be policed by terror to the very end. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris and General Hans Oster, long suspected by the regime, were murdered in concentration camps in 1945. Ludwig Beck, the early refuser, shot himself as arrest closed in. Field Marshal Witzleben was hanged after a travesty of a trial. Under Sippenhaft kin liability, families suffered interrogation and confinement for blood ties that had become charges. Yet the idea escaped the ropes. Within the collapsing Reich, rumors of officers who had acted circulated in barracks and kitchens, often in whispers, sometimes in guarded praise. The conspirators were not a single moral type. They were late and early, compromised and courageous. Some had served campaigns that expanded a criminal war. Some had opposed from the start. Many moved only when defeat made the abyss visible. Their motives were mixed, but their choice in the end was clear: to act, to risk execution, to try to change the course of a nation with a briefcase and a sheaf of orders. Strategically, their failure extended the war, and the winter of 1944-45 became a season of ruins. The Red Army stormed into East Prussia and across the Oder. The Western Allies broke out, crossed the Rhine, and rolled through cities that smelled of ash and wet stone. Morally, the attempt marked a boundary that historians still measure, the point at which professional duty bows to higher law. The oath of 1934 had fused the army to the ruler. The plotters cut that cord at the cost of their own lives, insisting that obedience is not a virtue when it serves crime. By May 1945, Berlin lay in rubble. Hitler was dead by his own hand on April 30th. The Reich capitulated in early May. The conspiracy could not save the cities already burned or the millions already dead. It could not erase crimes committed under the same flag the plotters wore. But it did inscribe a line that later Germany would read when it rebuilt institutions. That law must bind rulers, that conscience must guide soldiers, that uniforms do not absolve responsibility. In post-war years, July 20th became a date of contested memory, criticized by some as too late, honored by many as a last necessary stand. Return to the wooden room. The brown briefcase at the leg of a heavy table. Open windows and summer heat. The blast at 12:42 p.m. The survival that flipped certainty. And then the wires, the microphones, the orders that almost moved a state and then collapsed in the space of a phone call. For a few scorching minutes, the Nazi regime teetered. A brotherhood of officers had judged that with Hitler, Germany was doomed. Without him, an armistice and a moral salvage might still be possible. They failed to change the outcome of the war. They succeeded in proving something about the nation and the army that served it, that an army can remember the nation is not its ruler, and that even at the edge of ruin, men can choose the line that holds.